What if the greatest library in history was a lie? Deep beneath the sands of Egypt, an archaeologist discovered impossible blueprints, schematics for technology 2,000 years ahead of its time. But this wasn't a gift from the past. It was a weapon designed to control the human mind. A secret so dangerous, a powerful society has killed to keep it buried for centuries. The question is, why are they trying to turn it back on? The only light in the lab came from the monitors, casting a cool, sterile glow across Dr. Elara Vance's face. It was 3 a.m. The coffee in her mug was a cold, bitter memory. The city outside her window had long since surrendered to the night. But here, in this small, climate-controlled room, time was irrelevant. There was only the data. For Elara, data was truth. It was the only truth that mattered. It was clean, empirical, and free of the messy, contradictory narratives of human history. History was a story people told themselves. Data was the language the universe used to speak for itself. And right now, the universe was telling her something impossible. On the main screen, a topographic map of Alexandria, Egypt, shimmered in hues of processed green and blue. Her project was to conduct a deep GPR survey of the Serapeum, the so-called daughter library of the Great One. The official goal was to map the foundations of the ancient temple complex, to digitally preserve what little remained. But for months, the data had been predictable. Layers of Roman rubble, foundations of the Ptolemaic era, the faint signature of older settlements beneath. It was a neat, orderly layer cake of history, exactly as the textbooks described. Until tonight. There, glowing on her screen like a ghost, was the Anomaly. 20 meters beneath the lowest known foundation of the Serapeum, in a stratum of earth that should have been untouched for millennia, was a perfect rectangle of stark white. The GPR signal wasn't just reflecting, it was being absorbed, blanketed, in a way that suggested incredible density. The shape wasn't just regular, it was flawless. Nature didn't draw lines this straight. History didn't build with such clean, sharp angles and then leave no trace. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up cross-sections and density plots. The dimensions were astounding, 100 meters long, 30 meters wide. She isolated the signal, running it through a dozen filtering algorithms. It remained obstinate and perfect. On a second monitor, she overlaid every known historical map of the area, from ancient Roman scrolls to 19th century British surveys. Nothing. Not a hint, not a myth, not a whisper of a structure this deep, this large, this deliberate. A thrill, cold and sharp, cut through her exhaustion. This was the moment every scientist, every explorer dreamed of. The moment the map ended and true discovery began. This wasn't a forgotten temple cellar or a collapsed cistern. This was a violation. It was a single, defiant piece of data that called into question everything they thought they knew about the Serapeum, about Alexandria itself. It was a statistical impossibility, an architectural phantom, and it was screaming at her from the silent depths of the earth. Her world was built on the foundation of verifiable, empirical evidence, and this single image, this ghost in her machine, was about to smash that foundation to pieces. The office of Director Hassan Khalid was a monument to cultivated importance. The desk was a vast expanse of polished mahogany. The air was scented with expensive cologne, and the walls were adorned with framed photos of Khalid shaking hands with dignitaries and minor royalty. It was a room designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Today, it was working on Elara. She stood before the desk, her passion a stark contrast to the room's chilly opulence. On a large screen behind her, the GPR data was displayed in stunning clarity, the clean white rectangle glowing like a buried star. "Director Khalid, the signal is unambiguous," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "The material's density is off the charts, suggesting a lead or a similar heavy metal composition, which is unheard of for a structure of this period. The geometry is too precise to be a natural formation. This is an artificial structure, a significant one. Khalid didn't look at the screen. He was idly straightening a silver letter opener, his expression one of polite, impenetrable boredom. "Dr. Vance," he began, his voice smooth as worn silk. "Your enthusiasm is commendable, but we must be realistic." He gestured vaguely toward the window, at the bustling city beyond. "The ministry's budget is not infinite. The Serapeum is a delicate site. We cannot simply go digging holes based on what could be a deep earth geological fluke, a software glitch." "This is not a glitch," Elara countered, stepping forward. "I've run every diagnostic. The data is sound. This structure is there. We're talking about a completely unknown annex, something that doesn't appear in any historical record. Can you imagine the implications?" "I can," Khalid said, finally meeting her eyes. His were flat, devoid of the curiosity that should have been the lifeblood of a man in his position. "I can imagine the cost, the disruption to tourism, the political sensitivities of disturbing a site held sacred by multiple faiths throughout its history. I can imagine a great deal of trouble, all for the sakes of chasing, what did you call it, a statistical impossibility." He smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "In my experience, Doctor, things that are statistically impossible are, as a rule, not there. They are radar ghosts." The dismissal was absolute. It was a wall of polished, reasonable-sounding excuses, but Elara felt something else behind it. It wasn't just caution, it was a profound, willful lack of interest. It was the dogmatic refusal to even consider evidence that challenged the established narrative. Her science, her hard data, was being crushed by a man who refused to even look at it. "Director," she pleaded, her frustration mounting. "This isn't about belief, it's about evidence. The data demands investigation. My funding covers the initial survey. Just a test bore, that's all I'm asking." Khalid stood, signaling the end of the meeting. He walked to the door, placing a paternal hand briefly on her shoulder. "Your request is denied, Dr. Vance. I would advise you to focus your considerable talents on more fruitful endeavors, ones that exist in the known world." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Elara standing in the grand hallway, the perfect, impossible rectangle burning behind her eyes. It wasn't just a discovery anymore. It was a secret someone wanted to keep. The video call window showed a kind, weathered face, framed by unruly grey hair and crowded bookshelves. Professor Alistair Finch had been Elara's mentor, her champion, and the man who taught her that science required not just brilliance, but bulldog-like tenacity. "He called it a radar ghost, Alistair," Elara fumed, pacing the confines of her small Cairo apartment. The room was a mess of discarded clothes and open textbooks, a testament to a mind focused elsewhere. He looked at the most significant archaeological find of the 21st century and called it a software glitch. He didn't ask a single intelligent question. He just wanted me gone. Alistair listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. "Hassan Khalid," he murmured, steepling his fingers. "He's more politician than archaeologist. His family has been entwined with the ministry for generations. They see themselves as custodians of a narrative, not discoverers of fact. You didn't bring him data, Elara, you brought him a problem." "It's the truth," she insisted, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "What's the point of any of this if we just ignore what's right in front of us?" "Ah," Alistair said, a faint twinkle in his eye. "But you're not going to ignore it, are you?" Elara stopped pacing and stared at the screen. "He denied the permit, it's over." "Nonsense," her mentor scoffed gently. "Bureaucracy is a series of locked doors, my dear, and some doors require a key, while others require a battering ram. Fortunately, I have collected a few of both over the years. Let me make a few calls. Rattle a few cages at the Funding Council. Perhaps have a word with a friend at the Foreign Ministry. We'll get your test bore." Relief washed over Elara, so potent it almost buckled her knees. "Really? You think it will work?" "Oh, I think Khalid will find it very difficult to refuse a request that comes with the full weight of his international partners behind it," Alistair said. Then, his expression grew serious. "But be careful, Elara. The Serapeum, it has a complicated history. Many powerful people have fought and died over what that ground represents. When you start digging, you never know what you'll stir up. This isn't just about science anymore. Tread lightly." The words hung in the air after the call ended. Reassurance mixed with a faint, chilling sense of foreboding. She looked out her window at the sprawling, ancient city. Alistair was right. She had brought Khalid a problem, and now she was going to force him to solve it. A new, harder sense of determination settled over her. She had the data. She would get the proof, whatever the cost. Alistair Finch was as good as his word. The battering ram he'd promised came in the form of a series of polite but unyielding inquiries from international funding bodies and a quiet word from the British ambassador. Director Khalid, caught between his secret agenda and a very public diplomatic incident, had buckled. The permit was granted, albeit with a string of restrictive conditions, the most notable of which was the mandatory presence of a ministry-appointed historian to observe and document the proceedings. Weeks later, under a sun that beat down on the ruins of the Serapeum with the force of a physical blow, the dig was in full swing. The air tasted of dust and diesel from the generator. Elara, dressed in practical khaki and with her hair tied back, moved with the focused energy of a predator who has finally cornered its prey. The work was slow, a painstaking process of peeling back layers of time. First came the packed earth and rubble of the modern era, then the fragmented foundations of the Ottoman period. Deeper still, they brushed away sand from the intricate mosaics of Roman Alexandria. Below that, the grand, solid stonework of the Ptolemies began to emerge. Each layer was a page of history, and Elara was turning them one by one, getting closer to the chapter that had been deliberately torn out. Her observer from the ministry was a man named Dr. Tariq al-Jamil. He was in his 60s, with a face mapped by the same sun that now beat down on them, and eyes that held a gentle, scholarly warmth. Unlike Khalid, Tariq's interest was genuine, but it seemed to extend beyond the physical artifacts they unearthed. He spent most of his days sitting under a small canopy, watching the methodical work with a knowing look, as if he were watching a play whose ending he already knew. He approached Elara as she was examining a shard of Ptolemaic pottery. "You are a woman of great determination, Dr. Vance," he said, his voice a pleasant, melodic tenor. "I follow the data, Dr. Al-Jamil," Elara replied without looking up, her focus on the artifact. "Data is a modern word for what we have always known," Tariq said softly, "that the earth has a memory, but some memories, some stories, the stones themselves do not wish to tell." He looked from her to the ever-deepening pit. "You are not just digging for stones and pottery, are you? You are digging for one of those stories." Elara finally looked at him. His smile was kind, but his eyes were serious. She felt an unexpected sense of camaraderie with this man, a shared understanding that they were both seekers, even if their methods differed. She gave a slight nod. "Let's hope the stones decide to talk to me then." The sound, when it came, was an ugly violation of the dig's careful rhythm. Not the familiar scrape of steel on stone or the soft thud of earth, but a high-pitched grinding shriek of metal on metal. Every head in the pit snapped towards the source. The operator of the small backhoe killed the engine, and a sudden silence fell, thick and heavy. Elara was at the edge of the pit in seconds, peering down. A worker was on his knees, brushing frantically at the ground. "Doctor!" he called up, his voice tight. "It's not rock!" She scrambled down the ladder, her heart hammering against her ribs. The team parted as she approached. There, at the bottom of the pit, was a patch of exposed surface. It wasn't the warm sandstone of the Greek era or the mottled granite of the Roman. It was a flat, seamless expanse of dull, listless grey. It had no texture, no seams, no sign of construction blocks. It looked as if a piece of a battleship had been buried 20 meters beneath the desert. Elara dropped to her knees, ignoring the heat radiating from the ground. She pressed her palm against the surface. It was cool to the touch. She ran her fingers along it. Smooth, unyielding. She scraped at it with her trowel. The metallic shriek returned, and a small sliver of the material curled away. Lead. It was solid lead, impossibly thick. Her mind, a precision instrument trained to catalogue and explain, went blank. There was no rational explanation, no textbook entry, no historical precedent. A structure of this size, lined with lead this pure, was anachronistic to the point of absurdity. Lead of this thickness had only one practical purpose: to block radiation, to contain something that wasn't meant to get out. Tariq had made his way down into the pit and was standing silently behind her. She was so lost in the vortex of her own thoughts that she hadn't noticed him. She looked up at him, her face a mask of bewildered shock, expecting to see the same in him. But Tariq's expression was one of profound, somber recognition. "There is a story," he said, his voice barely a whisper in the vast open pit. "A legend the guides do not tell the tourists. They say that when the Great Library truly fell, it was not by a conqueror's torch. It was by a silent fire. A fire that burned not with heat, but with a cold poison. A fire that did not consume the scrolls, but the minds of those who read them." He looked from the lead plating to Elara's wide eyes. "They say the forbidden knowledge had to be buried deep, in a tomb that could contain its sickness. The team had cut a small, precise opening into the lead wall. The process took hours, their modern plasma cutters struggling against the ancient, dense metal. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the site, a section of the wall was finally pulled free, revealing a square of perfect, unbreached darkness. The air that drifted out was not the musty, damp air of a typical tomb. It was cold, sterile, and utterly still, as if it had been trapped and untouched by time itself. Elara, her face streaked with grime, insisted she and Tariq be the first to enter. Armed with powerful headlamps, they stepped across the threshold, leaving the warm Egyptian night for the chilling silence of the interior. Their lights cut through the blackness, revealing a space that defied all expectation. There were no crumbling stone shelves, no piles of rotted papyrus. The room was a perfect rectangle, just as the data had predicted. And arranged in neat, orderly rows were wooden racks, themselves impossibly preserved. On these racks sat not scrolls, but hundreds of sealed clay cylinders, each one capped with a plug of hardened bitumen. It looked less like a library and more like a wine cellar for forgotten gods. With trembling hands, Elara lifted one of the cylinders from its rack. It was cool and smooth. Tariq held his light steady as she carefully worked at the bitumen seal. It crumbled away into black dust. She tilted the cylinder, and a tightly rolled scroll slid into her waiting hands. The parchment was strange, not papyrus or vellum, but something with a faint metallic sheen, flexible and impossibly durable. She took a breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the tomb-like silence. This was it, the moment of truth. She unrolled the scroll. Her beam fell upon the surface, and the world tilted on its axis. There was no elegant Greek prose, no lost philosophy of Aristotle, no forgotten play of Sophocles. There were blueprints, breathtakingly complex schematics of machines that had no right to exist. Intricate diagrams of interlocking gears and lenses, annotated with a form of Hellenistic Greek, but describing principles of physics she barely understood. There were mathematical equations that wouldn't be discovered for another 2,000 years. Her light traced the elegant, impossible lines of a diagram for what looked like a resonance-based acoustic device, a detailed rendering of an optical system of terrifying precision, and something else. Something that made the blood run cold in her veins. Tariq gasped beside her, his light tracing the same lines. "By God," he whispered. "This is not a library." Elara stared, her scientific mind completely overwhelmed by the irrefutable, impossible truth laid bare in her hands. This wasn't a tomb for knowledge. It was a laboratory, and these were its terrible, beautiful inventions. The world outside their small field tent ceased to exist. For 3 days and 3 nights, Elara and Tariq lived in a feverish, hermetically sealed bubble of discovery. Time was measured not in hours, but in translated passages and rendered 3D models. The tent walls, once bare canvas, were now a chaotic tapestry of printouts, handwritten notes, and complex diagrams Elara had sketched out. The air was thick with the smell of old parchment, hot electronics, and stale coffee. They were fueled by a volatile cocktail of adrenaline and caffeine, sleep a forgotten luxury. Their partnership was a strange and perfect synthesis of 2 different worlds. Tariq, with his profound command of Hellenistic Greek and its nuanced dialects, would sit hunched over a scroll, his brow furrowed in concentration, murmuring the ancient words aloud. He would translate the annotations, the theoretical frameworks, the philosophical justifications for the incredible devices. Across the small table, Elara would take his translations and feed them into her laptop. With fingers that flew across the keyboard, she transformed 2,000-year-old theories into tangible visual models. On her screen, the impossible took shape. She rendered a device that used focused sound waves to heat and shape metal with a precision that modern science was only just beginning to achieve. She modeled a series of lenses and mirrors, described on another scroll, that could form a telescope powerful enough to see the moons of Jupiter, a feat that history attributed to Galileo 17 centuries later. The mathematics were sound. The physics, though described in an unfamiliar philosophical language, were undeniably advanced. Each new discovery was a jolt, a fresh shock to their understanding of the past. The scrolls detailed a sophisticated knowledge of metallurgy, acoustics, optics, and energy generation. But with every new revelation, the initial thrill of discovery became heavier, laced with a growing sense of dread. Their excitement was the giddy, terrified feeling of children who have found their father's loaded gun. Why would a society with this level of knowledge vanish without a trace? Why was this incredible science not celebrated in the annals of history, but buried in a lead tomb? What were they afraid of? The question hung in the charged air between them, unspoken, but ever present. They weren't just translating science. They were excavating the motive for its murder. The moment the world broke was quiet. It wasn't a shout of discovery, but a sharp, choked intake of breath. Elara looked up from her screen. Tariq was staring down at a scroll, his face ashen. The usual scholarly warmth in his eyes had been replaced by a look of sheer, undiluted horror. He had grown pale, his hand trembling slightly as he held the metallic parchment. "Elara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You need to see this." She moved to his side, her eyes scanning the passage he was pointing to. He began to translate, his voice low and shaky, as if he were afraid to speak the words aloud. "The discordant humours of the soul," he read. "Aggression, fear, and rebellion are but untuned strings on the lyre of the human corpus. As a skilled musician may soothe a discordant note, so too may we soothe the discordant soul." Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "What does that mean?" Tariq didn't answer. He just continued to translate the scroll's title, which was written in large, bold letters at the top. "The Psychoacoustic Harmonizer." Below the title was the master schematic, a terrifyingly elegant diagram of wave emitters, resonating chambers, and what looked like a targeting array. The annotations were chillingly precise. Tariq's finger traced the final damning sentence of the introductory text. "Through the application of precise sympathetic acoustic frequencies," he translated, his voice cracking, "the device can bypass the faulty vessel of rhetoric and reason and directly influence the electrochemical tides of the brain. It will pacify aggression. It will quell dissent. It will induce a state of euphoric, unquestioning compliance." Compliance. The word landed in the silent tent like a physical blow. Elara stared at the blueprint, at the cold, beautiful, monstrous logic of it. This wasn't a tool for understanding the universe. It was a tool for controlling people. A weapon. A mind control weapon, conceived and designed 2 millennia ago. The myth Tariq had told her of the silent fire that poisoned the mind crashed into her thoughts. It wasn't a myth. It was a historical account. The beautiful thesis of the Great Library, the shining beacon of human intellect and philosophical inquiry, was a lie. A beautiful, comforting lie that had now been shattered. This place, this buried lead-lined secret, wasn't a library. It was a weapons lab, and they had just found the blueprint for its most terrible creation. They were jolted from a fitful, exhausted sleep by shouting. The grey light of dawn was filtering through the canvas of the tent. Elara's head snapped up from the table where she'd passed out, her heart instantly pounding. The shouts were close, laced with panic. She and Tariq scrambled outside. The scene was one of chaos and violation. Their field lab, their sealed sanctuary of discovery, had been torn apart. The tent flap was slashed open. Inside, papers were strewn everywhere, their meticulous notes and printouts trampled into the dirt. Laptops were smashed. But worst of all, the heavy, secure case where they stored the most critical scrolls, the ones detailing the weapon, was lying on its side, its lock pried open. It was empty. 2 Egyptian security guards, the ones assigned to the site, were questioning the night watchman, a bewildered old man who could only stammer about seeing nothing, hearing nothing. It had been a professional job, silent, efficient. As the reality of the violation washed over Elara, a cold dread creeping up her spine, her phone began to ring. The caller ID read, Director Hassan Khalid. Her hand shook as she answered. Hello? Khalid's voice was not the smooth, dismissive tone she remembered from his office. It was as cold and sharp as broken glass. There was no preamble, no greeting. Dr. Vance, your project is terminated. The permit has been revoked, effective immediately. What? Why? Elara stammered, looking at the wreckage of her lab. We've been robbed, Director. Someone stole the artifacts. The site is now under a full national security review. Khalid's voice cut in, flat and final. All materials are to be confiscated. You and your associate are to vacate the premises within the hour. A military detail is on its way. But you don't understand what we found. The line went dead. He had hung up. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The robbery, the call, it was a coordinated attack. The abstract threat that had haunted the edges of their discovery had finally stepped out of the shadows. It had a name, it had influence, and it had just stripped them of everything. The alleys of Alexandria at night are a labyrinth of shadows and sound, a world away from the sun-bleached monuments. Elara and Tariq hurried through the throng, their shoulders hunched, every footstep behind them sounding like a threat. After the military had seized the site, Tariq had pulled Elara aside, his face grim. With a furtive glance, he had revealed the scroll he'd slipped into his coat lining, while she had been distracted by the initial discovery. The one detailing a failsafe, a potential counter-frequency for the harmonizer. It was all they had left. Now, they were fugitives. Every face in the crowd seemed to watch them. Elara, a woman of science and reason, felt a raw paranoia she had only ever read about in spy novels. Her world of data and evidence had been replaced by a world of whispers and fear. She was a loose end, a witness to a truth someone had killed to keep buried. This way, Tariq urged, pulling her into a narrower, less crowded street. I know a place we can... He was cut off by a deafening screech of tires. Elara looked up and saw a pair of headlights bearing down on them. A large, rusted transport truck had swerved violently, mounting the curb and accelerating, its massive grille aimed directly at them. There was no time to think. Instinct took over. Tariq yanked her arm, pulling her into a recessed doorway, a narrow gap in the stone wall, just as the truck roared past. The wind of its passage tore at their clothes. It smashed through the storefront where they had been standing seconds before, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood exploding through the night. The truck didn't slow. It didn't stop. It plowed back onto the street and sped away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. They were left in the sudden, ringing silence, their bodies pressed against the cold stone of the alleyway, chests heaving. Shards of glass littered the ground around them. Elara stared at the wreckage, her mind struggling to process the event. This wasn't a drunk driver. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to erase them. She looked at Tariq, his face pale in the dim light, and saw her own terror reflected in his eyes. The pragmatist, the scientist who had once scoffed at conspiracy theories, had just been violently thrown into a world where they were real and deadly. Her worldview, already fractured, was now being forcibly pulverized by brute force. They weren't just academics who had stumbled onto a secret anymore. They were targets. The safe house was a sanctuary of dust and paper. It belonged to a retired professor of semiotics, a man Tariq had known for 40 years, and it smelled of old leather bindings, pipe tobacco, and scholarly neglect. Books were not just on shelves. They were in precarious stacks on the floor, on every chair, on the kitchen counter. For the first time in days, Elara felt she could breathe. Here, surrounded by the quiet weight of accumulated knowledge, the visceral fear of the truck attack receded, replaced by the familiar drive to understand. They laid the scroll, the single, precious scroll Tariq had saved, on a large wooden table under the warm glow of a banker's lamp. The metallic parchment shimmered, its secrets waiting. Stripped of her high-tech lab, her satellite data, and her processing software, Elara was forced to rely on fundamentals: her mind, Tariq's expertise, and the contents of the scroll itself. It was, as Tariq had suspected, a failsafe. The document was a brilliant piece of reverse engineering, detailing how to generate a precise counter-frequency. Elara, sketching equations on a notepad, recognized the physics. It wasn't about overpowering the harmonizer's signal. It was about resonance. It was designed to introduce a sympathetic vibration that would cascade through the original signal, rendering it inert, like a singer shattering a glass with the perfect note. It was elegant, non-destructive, and a potential weapon in their fight for survival. Hope, fragile but real, began to flicker within her. While Elara focused on the science, Tariq delved into his own world. He surrounded himself with obscure books from the professor's collection, apocryphal histories, Gnostic texts, accounts from travelers deemed unreliable by mainstream academia. For hours, he was silent, his eyes scanning pages of dense Greek and Coptic script. "Here," he finally said, his voice hushed with discovery. He slid an old, leather-bound volume across the table. The page was open to a passage from a discredited history of the Alexandrian patriarchs. "Listen." And Theophilus did cast down the idols of the Serapeum, but the silent priests had already done their work, safeguarding the mundus intellectualis, the world of the intellect, from the sickness of its own hubris. "Silent priests?" Elara asked. "A footnote here," Tariq said, his excitement growing as he connected the threads. "It refers to another text, which calls them the Curatores, the Curators." He looked up at Elara, his eyes alight. A secret society founded in the Hellenistic period, drawn from the highest echelons of the Museum. Their sole purpose was not to share knowledge, but to judge it, to decide what humanity was ready for, and what needed to be hidden, buried, erased. The Curators. The name felt ancient, powerful. It was the missing piece, the name for the shadow that had been hunting them. Elara stared at the complex physics of the counter-frequency on her notepad, then at the ancient text describing a secret society of scientific censors. Her world of hard data and Tariq's world of apocryphal lore had just slammed together. They weren't two different worlds at all. They were two sides of the same terrifying coin. Their meeting was on a rooftop cafe overlooking the chaotic splendor of the city. The informant was a junior archivist from the ministry, a young man with nervous eyes and hands that couldn't keep still. He had been located through the same university network that had provided the safe house, his conscience, and a significant sum of money, persuading him to talk. "You cannot use my name," the archivist whispered, stirring a sugar cube into his tea with a rattling spoon. "Director Khalid is a powerful man. His family is very old." "We know," Tariq said in a calm, reassuring tone. "We just need to understand his connections." "It's not a ministry connection," the young man said, leaning closer. "It's private, a society, the Helios Heritage Society. That's what they call it publicly. It's a historical preservation group, very exclusive, very wealthy. And Khalid's family is involved?" Elara pressed. "Involved? They've been at its heart for generations," the archivist scoffed, a flicker of resentment in his eyes. "He sits on the board. But the money, the real power, doesn't come from here. It comes from Europe, from their primary benefactor." He slid a hand into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He pushed it across the table. "A foundation based in Switzerland, the Loros Foundation." Elara unfolded the paper. It was a printout from a Society magazine's website. The photo showed a lavish gala in Geneva. Standing side by side, shaking hands and smiling for the camera, were two men. One was director Hassan Khalid. The other was an older man, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, with cold, intelligent eyes and an air of absolute authority. The caption beneath the photo read, "Egyptian Director of Antiquities, Hassan Khalid, with Cassian Loros, Chairman of the Loros Foundation." Cassian Loros, the shadow patron. The name seemed to suck the air from around the table. The conspiracy now had a hierarchy, a structure. Khalid wasn't the master. He was a functionary. The real power, the money and influence that could make military details appear and assassination attempts happen, lay with this man. The conflict was no longer about a local cover-up. They had stumbled into a global conspiracy, one where science and history were not quests for truth, but simply assets to be controlled. They cornered Khalid in a place he felt safe, a place that was the heart of his power, a vast, cavernous museum storage warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was night. The only light came from high, dusty windows, casting long, distorted shadows over rows upon rows of wooden crates. Each crate held a piece of history, a forgotten statue, a collection of pottery, a fragment of a sarcophagus, all silent witnesses to their confrontation. He was overseeing a shipment, and they used the distraction to approach him, appearing from behind a stack of Roman amphorae. He wasn't surprised to see them, only weary. The two large men with him tensed, but Khalid raised a calming hand. "So, the fugitives have become hunters," he said, his voice losing its polished, bureaucratic edge, replaced by a tone of resignation. "I suppose this was inevitable." "The Curators," Elara said, the name feeling heavy and dangerous on her tongue. "That's the real name of your Heritage Society, isn't it?" Khalid's mask of polite dismissal finally fell away completely. A strange, serene look came over his face, the look of a true believer. "Yes," he said softly. "I am a curator, as was my father, and his father before him. We have kept this vigil for 2,000 years. "Vigil?" Tariq scoffed. "You call theft and attempted murder a vigil?" "I call it protecting humanity from itself," Khalid snapped, his calm cracking for a moment. He gestured around the warehouse at the silent, crated history. "You see these as treasures. I see them as the remnants of civilizations that crumbled under their own weight, their own hubris. Yours would be no different." He lowered his voice, speaking with a chilling, rational passion. "You think you found a library. You found a Pandora's box. Our ancestors were the scientists of the Museum, the greatest minds of their age. They created the harmonizer to bring peace, to end the endless cycle of war and rebellion, and so they tested it, just once, on a small quarter of the city." He paused, his eyes distant, as if seeing a vision from the past. It did not bring peace. It brought a babbling, euphoric madness, mass psychosis, riots born not of anger, but of a terrifying, mindless joy. It was a plague of the soul. My ancestors saw what they had unleashed. They saw that humanity was not meant for such shortcuts, that our flaws, our aggression, our dissent are part of us. To remove them is to break us. So they did the only thing they could. They created the counter-frequency, contained the outbreak, and then they buried it all. They erased the lab from history and swore an oath to stand guard, to protect mankind from the poison of a perfect world. Elara stared at him, speechless. This wasn't the ranting of a simple villain. It was a coherent philosophy, a terrifyingly compelling argument from a corrupted idealist. Her entire life had been dedicated to the principle that knowledge must be free. And here was a man, the descendant of scientists, arguing passionately for its suppression, for censorship as the ultimate act of love. Khalid took a step closer. I tried to handle this quietly, to take back what was ours and let you fade away, but you persisted, and now you have the attention of Cassian Loros. He shares our goal, but not our patience. He does not believe in waiting for humanity to destroy itself. He believes in preventative action. He gave them a look of genuine, paternalistic pity. Run, hide, disappear. It won't matter. He will find you, and he will not be as merciful as I have been. Khalid's warning echoed in the silence he left behind, a chilling prophecy that settled deep in Elara's bones. They were no longer just running from a conspiracy. They were running from its endgame. Their new sanctuary was a ghost of the modern world, a disused subway station, abandoned decades ago, its tiled walls sweating in the subterranean damp. In the cavernous dark, Elara knelt on the grimy platform, her laptop casting a solitary pool of light, its screen powered by a cable clipped to a car battery they had stolen. While Tariq kept watch, his silhouette a lonely figure at the top of the concrete stairs, Elara worked with a desperate intensity. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was a codebreaker, an engineer, a strategist, all at once. She pored over the digital copies of the failsafe scroll, her mind a whirlwind of physics and ancient Greek. The counter-frequency was brilliant, but as she modeled its wave mechanics, she found something else. A flaw. Not in the countermeasure, but in the original design of the harmonizer itself. The failsafe scroll didn't just describe how to neutralize the weapon, it inadvertently revealed its greatest vulnerability. It showed how the primary signal could be hijacked, its frequency modulated by an external source. A cold, horrifying thought began to crystallize in her mind. Khalid's story of their ancestors burying the technology out of fear. It was too simple. True scientists, even repentant ones, don't just bury a problem. They analyze it, they understand it, they fix it. With a surge of adrenaline, she tethered her laptop to a cheap burner phone, the connection agonizingly slow. She searched for Cassian Loros and his foundation. She bypassed the public-facing charity work and dug into its corporate filings, its research grants, its subsidiary corporations. And there it was. A major subsidiary, registered as an urban development consultant, was a primary contractor for something called the Aura Project. Its stated purpose, developing large-scale, non-lethal acoustic technology for crowd pacification in high-conflict urban centers. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The curators hadn't been hiding the weapon for 2,000 years. They had been perfecting it. They had solved the flaw that caused the mass psychosis, turning the uncontrollable sickness into a targeted tool. Khalid's story wasn't a lie, but an archaic mission statement for a project that had long since evolved. His faction were the traditionalists, the guardians of the original oath. But Loros was the progressive. He wasn't guarding the past, he was building the future. And he was planning to switch his weapon on. The heart of the beast was not in a dusty tomb or a secret vault, but near the sky. The Loros Foundation's data center occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in Geneva. It was a fortress of glass and steel, cooled air, and the ceaseless hum of servers processing the world's information. Hidden within this digital fortress, accessible only by a private biometric elevator, was the lab. It was a temple of minimalist design, White walls, polished chrome, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glittering city lights. In the center of the room, sleek and beautiful like a piece of modern sculpture, sat the psychoacoustic harmonizer. It bore no resemblance to the ancient diagrams, but Elara recognized its soul, the fundamental architecture of the resonating chambers, now rendered in carbon fiber and glowing with soft blue LEDs. An old but imposing man stood before it, Cassian Loros. He watched as his technicians made the final calibrations. On a vast screen that dominated one wall, a satellite map was displayed, a pulsing red circle highlighting a densely populated city district in Central Asia, a place torn by sectarian violence. A countdown timer in the corner of the screen read 12 minutes. Elara and Tariq slipped into the control room from a service corridor, their hearts pounding. Getting here had taken everything they had. Tariq's silver-tongued persuasion with a disgruntled maintenance chief, and Elara's quick thinking, using her knowledge of the building's schematics to time their entry during a shift change. They had no weapons, only the USB drive in Elara's pocket. Loros turned, his eyes registering no surprise, only a flicker of annoyed curiosity, as if he were looking at a pair of mice that had somehow found their way into his sterile laboratory. "Dr. Vance, Dr. Al-Jamil," he said, his voice calm and cultured. "I must confess I underestimated your resourcefulness. A pity you wasted it only to bear witness to the inevitable." "You're not preventing war! You're enforcing slavery!" Elara shot back, her voice trembling but firm. Loros smiled, a thin, chilling expression. "Slavery is the absence of choice. I am merely removing the worst of their choices. For centuries, we have watched humanity burn in the fires of its own rage. We gave them philosophy, art, law, and they chose to build bombs. No more. Tonight we give them the one thing they have always craved but never achieved: peace. A quiet, orderly, and permanent peace. It will be my gift to them." He gave a slight nod to the guards by the door. "You will be held comfortably. You will have the privilege of watching the birth of a better world." As the guards moved forward, Elara lunged, not for an escape, not for a weapon, but for the main console. Before anyone could react, she slammed the USB drive into its port. An alarm blared. Loros's eyes widened, not in anger, but in confusion. "A virus, childish," he scoffed. "Not a virus," Elara said, her eyes locked on the main screen. "A key." She hit enter. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the targeting vector on the world map began to flicker. The pulsing red circle wavered, then dissolved. The clean sine waves on the diagnostic monitors dissolved into a chaotic hash of white noise. A wave of harmless, nullifying static washed through the system, a perfectly engineered whisper of math that found the core of Loros's machine and sang it into silence. The weapon wasn't destroyed. It was simply inert, useless. Loros stared at the screen, his face a mask of disbelief. 2 millennia of planning, of perfecting, of waiting. Undone in 5 seconds. Undone not by an army or a bomb, but by a ghost from the very history he had sought to conquer. His life's work had been silenced. Months later, the sun was rising over the Alexandria Corniche, painting the calm Mediterranean waters in hues of gold and rose. The air was cool and clean. The world was utterly unchanged, blissfully unaware of the silent war that had been fought for its soul. Loros and the Curators had vanished. With their great weapon neutralized and their leadership exposed, the organization had collapsed in on itself, its funding cut off, its influence evaporating like sea spray in the morning sun. Elara and Tariq walked along the seafront, 2 ordinary academics enjoying the dawn. The silence between them was comfortable, born of shared trauma and triumph. "And the scrolls?" Tariq finally asked, his voice soft. "The data from your laptop, what did you do with it?" Elara looked out at the endless horizon. The scientist in her, the woman she had been, had screamed to publish it, to share the monumental discovery with the world. But she wasn't that woman anymore. "I didn't destroy it," she said. "That would be an act of fear, and I didn't release it. The world isn't ready for it. Khalid was right about that much." She paused, watching a fishing boat head out to sea. "I became the new curator," she continued. "I encrypted the data, all of it, the schematics, the physics, the history. Then I fractured it into thousands of pieces and hid them in the biggest, most chaotic library in human history, the deep web. I buried them in redundant code, anonymous servers, and forgotten corners of the digital world. There's no map, only I know how to find the pieces and put them back together." She had accepted the burden. The knowledge was safe, neither destroyed nor in the hands of those who would misuse it. It was waiting. She had taken the secret that had haunted the world for 2,000 years and given it a new, more responsible guardian. A guardian who understood that the quest for knowledge must be tempered with the wisdom to know when to let it sleep. This story begins as a classic conflict we think we understand. The empirical scientist, Dr. Vance, fighting against a shadowy conspiracy to uncover a hidden truth. We root for her because we believe that knowledge is light and secrecy is darkness. But the story's brilliant turn is that the real conflict is much more complicated and far more unsettling. The most powerful moment isn't the discovery of the mind control weapon, but the antagonist's justification for hiding it. Khalid isn't a power-hungry tyrant. He's a guardian of a terrible secret, a descendant of scientists who saw their creation cause mass psychosis. His argument, that some knowledge is a poison that humanity isn't ready for, is chilling because it's rational. It weaponizes the very idea of caution and responsibility against the scientific ideal of open discovery. This forces us to question a core belief of our modern age, that all information deserves to be free. Elara's final choice isn't a simple victory for science. By choosing to encrypt and hide the data herself, she validates the curator's core fear, even as she rejects their violent methods. She doesn't publish her findings. She accepts the burden of becoming a new kind of guardian. It leaves us with a difficult question. If you discovered knowledge so powerful it could save the world or break it, what would you do? Is it your duty to share it, or your burden to hide it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.